Okay, this is going to be a video about disassembling a PT111 G2. As some of you know, I have a prototype single action only trigger on my gun. I'm taking apart the gun to make prototype 2. Prototype 1 I like, but it is a prototype, has some issues that have to be resolved, a little better geometry angle on things. As you can see, I cocked the gun. This is the free play. That's the brake line right there. That's the brake. Does not go back further than that. That's it. No restrike. So, like I said, I like it. Time for prototype 2, so I'm going to take apart the gun. Figured I would show you guys how I do it, since there's not a lot of great videos about taking apart the whole gun. And I'm also this is gonna be kind of a long video because I'm gonna give some tips as I'm taking it apart, things you can do at different levels to improve your gun and whatnot. Disclaimer: you're an adult. If you're not an adult, don't be touching with handguns. Anything you do with a handgun is your responsibility, not mine. So use caution. If you're not comfortable doing this stuff, don't do it. If you're not willing to take responsibility for yourself, don't do it. That being said, here we go. Couple standard things. Some of these probably seem pretty cheesy to you guys or goofy. Tape works great for holding the gun on while you're driving out the pins. You do have to drive these out. They're not spring loaded, although they're not too terribly hard. Probably the weirdest thing that I have on here is a huge magnet. I don't usually take apart the rear sear assembly. I just set it on top of a magnet to hold it all together. That's just out of a hard drive. I work in IT, so I have a lot of hard drive magnets laying around. Couple pins to drive out the pins. This is broken drill bit and a couple nails that actually work really well for me. They're the perfect size, so that's why I use them. Hammer, of course. Small screwdriver. Our dike's handy. Cheap dental pick I think I got in a package from Harbor Freight for a couple bucks. Anyway, so a couple points as I'm going through this. Let's see. First of all, I love my Mechar 18 round for P226. I got this off eBay. I thought this was the what do they call it? X grip. It's not. This is for, I guess this is some knockoff. It actually fits fine. I like it. Amerigun. I don't even know what this is. But it's for the same thing. This is the MMP grip extension. So as you can see, it fits decently. It feels fine in your hand. Everything feels great. This one doesn't match the stippling of the gun or anything, but still like it. Anyway, on the way through that, if you run into an issue where you're one of the few unlucky people who can't get the slide to lock back, I should show you that. So mine locks back just fine. You know, nothing weird. If you're one of the people who has a little bit of problem with that because of machining differences or whatnot, the springs, the reason that happens is because the springs in the Mechar mags are actually a little lighter. The stock PT111 G2 mag springs are tough. Those things are firm. So what happens is, if you notice right here, and you can kind of see it while I have this apart, this is the slide release. It just has a little tab down there. Let me see if I can get to focus on that a little bit better. So there's a little tab. Give me just 1 second here. So you have this little tab here. That is what interacts with the mag. You know, once the mag is unloaded, that little tab on the corner of the mag, and I realize this is black on black, so a little bit hard to see. But when you push this down, see, that pops up, and that's what actually moves the slide release upwards. So there's a couple things that can happen, and these are just simply slight tolerance differences between guns, why yours might not lock back, or might not lock back with a stock mag either. So if that tab is up a little bit more, or your spring for some reason on, because there's actually, you can barely see it here, that's the edge of it right there. That is the spring, and you'll see it more when I take the gun apart further, for the slide release. So if that spring is just wound a little tighter or something, what'll happen is that spring pushes the slide release down. So if it's counteracting the mag spring too hard, your slide release won't come up far enough, as you see here. It won't come up far enough and it won't lock the slide back. So there's a couple things you can do. You can either unwind this a little bit. One of the things is you can actually bend the spring upward a little bit, if you notice, even without taking apart the gun. You can grip it right there and bend it up just a little bit at a time. Be careful. Use your good judgment here. You can bend it up a little bit, then release it, see if you got a little room. Before you do that even, you can make sure that underneath the slide release is well lubed, and you can kind of push it in and work it up and down a little bit like this. Make sure everything's in there working really smoothly. This tab, be careful you don't break it off, but this tab can be slightly bent downward just a little bit. All those things help this not push downward so hard, which is the problem you're having. When you have in that mag and it's empty, it's trying to push up that, and if it's pushing downward too hard or there's something holding it up from coming upward, you can have a little bit of an issue with the slide release. Anyway, that's enough on that subject. For people who want a smoother trigger, if you're not going to take apart the whole gun, that's fine. There's actually a lot you can do on this gun while leaving it relatively together. The biggest points for rough action or just kind of lightening things up a little bit, if you just feel there's too much friction in the trigger and whatnot, the trigger bar impacts 2 points rather firmly. And if you notice here, you can see the light gap through there. The trigger bar does not impact the plastic frame all the way along its ride. It only does it kind of in these corners, right here and then back here. So if you don't like the amount of friction you're getting from your trigger, you can actually take a small screwdriver like this. In my case, when I first did this, simple polishing compound. So you can slide something like a small screwdriver in here. This frame bends just a little bit. It's probably hard for you guys to see, but you don't want to get rough or aggressive with the frame, but you can see now that I've pushed this away, there's a little bit of room in there. You put a little bit of polishing compound, work it back and forth on both sides. You can do that on this side. You notice now you don't have that gap there, but forgive me, this is just a little bit awkward. So you slide in a screwdriver, you get enough gap between that metal and the frame to put in a little bit of polishing compound. Like I said, don't be overly rough. Pack it in there a little bit, and you would sit there and just basically, with the gun in this position, sit there and watch TV, working back and forth. You can put a little bit of pressure into the bar to kind of shove it against that corner. You're going to do the same thing on this side. You can do it at the same time. Take your screwdriver, slide it in just a little bit. You can get some polishing compound in between the trigger bar and the plastic frame there. Let me see if I can get myself to focus there. And the plastic frame, and also underneath the, I always forget what this guy is called, but underneath this guy right here, between the trigger bar and them. So a little bit of polishing compound all around this area. This actually doesn't cause a lot of friction, but there are several notches in this. So if you're feeling like you have a really notchy trigger and you want to get that resolved, you would do the same thing, pack some polishing compound under here. You can literally sit in front of your TV, push a little bit against this bar, work it back and forth, push down on this guy just a little bit, work it back and forth. As you notice, mine's been pretty polished, but there are several notches in this. So if you don't like the notchiness, this is the point you want to address. If you don't like the amount of friction you're getting, these two corners right here and right here, where the trigger bar is riding against the plastic frame or polymer frame, that's what you want to look at. So that's kind of some tips for what you could see as far as trigger pull. Oh, and the last thing as far as trigger pull is actually in the other half. So here you have the striker blocker, striker block, striker blocker. People who use 1911s call it like a Series 80. But it's really for striking the blocker when the trigger's not all the way back. So the trigger being pulled back, some people call this the shark fin or whatever. I call it the striker block activator, although I suppose shark fin is faster to say. This, as you're pulling the trigger back, rides upward, as you can see, hits the striker block. So in stock form, mine is actually fairly rounded. I've smoothed mine out considerably here. And that's really easy to do. I'll show you how in just a minute. You don't want to take any off the face, because if you do, it won't push this up far enough and your striker might not have the clearance that it needs to go all the way forward. So you might get light primer strikes, all sorts of weird things. Apparently Apex actually had an ultimate striker block that did that. They brought this in too far, they tapered it in too far, and you could look up Apex. I think this is for the military and police version, but you can look up old striker block versus new striker block for Apex, military and police. And people commenting it wasn't a big deal, but some guns, machining tolerances and whatnot, we're having an issue with this, because what happened was they brought in the taper too far, and so the striker block activator wasn't actually hitting the highest point on this. The highest point on the striker block activator wasn't actually hitting the lowest point on the striker block. So that's what was happening. So the striker block wasn't getting all the way out of the way as it should have been. So I'll show you how to take that apart. In fact, we'll start right there with taking the gun apart. I will warn you ahead of time, the first time I took this apart, I didn't realize how sprung this was. This little guy right here is heavily sprung. I don't know why, but this is actually the pin that holds the whole assembly into place. So there's a spring underneath this. What happens is you push down on that and the extractor can slide out. This is just the pivot for the extractor. So the spring under this doesn't do anything more than combat gravity. There's no force against it or anything. It's just holding this pivot pin that holds the extractor into place. So I actually lost my spring, so you guys will see that I have a cheesy little spring. I need to get a replacement, but what I have works great and it doesn't affect the function of the weapon at all. So I haven't bothered to track down a replacement yet. But be very aware of that when you take this apart. Hold your hand over it when you start sliding this extractor out, because that thing can go zinging across the room. So we'll start, this part comes apart just like a Glock. All you have to do is push this down, slide that up, whole striker comes out. If you do want to take apart the striker for some reason, which actually polishing the face of this will give you a significantly lighter pull, so I can actually show you guys how to do that. So take the striker block apart, something like this, you push down, you can set something under it too. So you see if I can get it in a position where my camera can see what's going on. So these guys are exactly like a Glock, so there's probably a million videos out there. You lift up these little plastic tabs. It's a little more difficult while I'm trying to get a video of it. Trying to get my fat fingers out of the way here. So you can lift these up individually. They're two halves that pop out like that. When they both pop out, the whole spring will slide up. You can remove the whole thing. That's it. So at that point, you can polish that guy, polish the face of that striker, which does help. I found it made a pretty significant difference on the single action, as far as not really smoothness so much, because it was pretty smooth already on the single action pull, but it did lighten it up a little bit. So anyway, set that guy off to the side. Striker for this guy. What you want to do, take something fairly small around. I think my screwdriver here actually fits, although it may not. But anyway, I've always used this guy, so forgive me that this is difficult to show you. You're going to be pushing down right in the center of this guy, and you can see it right there. Push down right in the center, and then you're going to want to carefully ease the extractor out a little bit, and before it'll kind of slide down past the lip. So I'll show you guys what I'm talking about here. So you push down. Like I said, mine's a little different than normal because I do have that spring in there. So once you push down and start getting it out, it'll pop out of its socket. At this point, you do not want to remove that extractor any further before you get your thumb firmly over there. So, see, you can slide something behind the extractor here. Probably use a screwdriver so I don't. Yep. So I don't know if you heard that pop, where even with my cheesy little spring, it popped up. So before we look too much further in here, this is the extractor, and this is the spring for the extractor. So it goes in right like this. This is what the striker blocker rides against, so it sits in exactly like this right here. I apologize for my video. For some reason, I don't know if the Earth's alignment is wrong in this spot or what, but it does not like this one particular spot in my kitchen where I can always take videos. So it sits in there right like that. This spring is what activates it, so we can set those off to the side. This particular spring here, it seems universal. It does not appear that it has a direction that it goes in, so as long as it's in the right space, pointing the right direction, you're good. Okay, so at this point, the striker block can come out along with a little pivot pin. See, there's a striker block. One of the nice things about this Taurus, and there's a little spring that comes with it. I'll set that off to the side. One of the nice things about this Taurus, as far as polishing it, opposed to the M&P, is the M&P has a little lip around this edge. So if you do want to polish your striker block for, you know, if you just want to polish it up here, and you can tell from mine that mine has been pretty heavily polished. I've tried not to come too far down here, but I have given a little more of an angle coming upward, which is fine. And polish it up real good so when that striker block activator pushes against it, it just slides right down. That's really what we're going for, is that instead of hitting a wall and having to push past the wall, we want it to push and then just slide down. So there are many ways you can do this. I've seen things about people setting them for MMPs on something and trying to get it to spin around and whatnot. Lose it. And I can tell you that since this one is straight and there's no lip up there, this was my admittedly redneck way of doing it. I very gently chucked it up in a drill. This point you can see how I polished it. Fine grade sandpaper. As you can see, that does not take a whole lot of effort on your part. And you don't want to remove a whole lot of material. Like I said, you can taper up this angle a little bit, and you want to smooth this out. You don't want to remove anything from the face, because you don't want to make it shallower, or else your striker block won't work. And you don't want to skinny this angle in too far, or the tip of the striker block might not hit the tip of this. Obviously be gentle when you're chucking it up in a drill, if you're doing it that way. It seems to be fairly hard steel, as you can tell on mine. You know, this is the way it came from the factory. No damage was done to this or anything. You don't have to worry about polishing anything else on this guy, just kind of this edge around there. That's the striker block. Okay. It's the whole extractor mechanism, except for this guy. Like I said, this guy pops up. I'll actually show you what it looks like here. Although mine with my cheesy spring is a little bit of a pain to get back in. I'll take the spring out. So my cheesy spring is remaining in there. It's staying there. But that's it. This is the little guy here. Normally a spring sits inside. It is simply the pivot that pops into place that the extractor rides against. So that's it. That spring simply holds this up, and this rides against this pivot. that is pretty much it for the upper portion. It's all taken apart. So you can clean this all out, clean it out really good, give it a light oiling, you know, make sure everything's in there. I don't see any reason to ever take off the loaded chamber indicator, so I've never even bothered, although it does look like it's just a pin. It looks like a roll pin that goes through there. If there was some reason that you want to take that apart, I can't see why. Okay, so moving on to the lower. I will try to show you guys me driving out these pins. I'm not sure how stable this is going to be on the work platform and the tripod that I have, so just know that all I'm going to do is literally drive out these 3 pins from this direction. So I'm going to take this guy, set it on top of a piece of electrical tape right here, which either electrical or masking tape can work really, really well for this, because basically you're trying to pad the gun a little bit, so you want something that's not super hard so you don't scratch up your surface too badly. You want to scratch up the surface. So you set it right here, basically line it up and drive the pin through the tape, through the hole in the center of the tape. So I know this seems cheesy, but it actually seems to work really well for me. I'm a little extra awkward because I've literally got the camera in front of me that I'm trying not to tip over. So you can see there's pin number 1. If you get in this position where your tape isn't quite tall enough, give it a little pull. Okay, there's pin number 1. Pin number 2, I usually do the back pin next. This one is a little bit smaller. The drill bit that I use to drive these out here. Try to find a punch, but I had a hard time finding punches this long that were the right diameter. So, see, same thing here. You can either grab it with the pliers and pull it out. Give it another few taps like this. There comes out the pin. And I should really put all these little guys off to the side in something where they won't roll away. That would be an excellent idea as I'm beating on this. So this last guy is a little bit weird. I didn't have a drill bit this small, so I actually start it with the slightly larger drill bit, which only goes in a little ways because it is smaller. Then I have a nail that I found worked pretty good. I flatten the end off, tap it out. There's that pin. So as you can see now, at this point we have 3 pins out. The next thing that we have to do is to remove the slide release, which can be, sometimes it comes out really easily and sometimes it's super awkward. So what you want to do here, just one second. Okay, I'm going to try to get my camera to focus here. So what you want to do is this kind of has a saddle on the underside, and you'll see better once I take it out what I'm talking about. So this saddle kind of straddles this little cap that is sprung. So what you want to do is release the pressure off this cap and get something that's kind of small. So you're going to need 2 relatively small objects. I have a little screwdriver here, and I can use my little drill bit to push it through, or you can have 2 small screwdrivers, whatever you like. So your goal, and this is much more awkward when I'm trying to keep a camera pointing at it, is to push down on that cap to unspring it, and then just kind of, you don't want to jam whatever you have in there too far because then it'll lift. You see, if I do that, it kind of puts some pressure against the slide release. So you want to just gently give it a little bit of downward force, so you're compressing that spring, and then you kind of want to rock this guy back and forth just a little bit until you get a little movement there. And if you notice, It might be hard to see that it's sticking out a little bit further. I just lost all my progress. So this guy, like I said, it is a little weird, and the fact that I'm trying to do this in front of a camera makes it a lot more difficult, actually. But you basically just want to get that over the top of that saddle. So you kind of wiggle it back and forth. And like I said, sometimes this thing slid right out for me. Other times, it's been a huge pain. Looks like it might go out the other way easier this time. See, I kind of have it at a little angle there, trying to slide it out. Let me see if I can't get a little more traction with this guy. Because I don't know if you can see that, but what I'm trying to do is press down on that spring while getting something with the least amount of... I don't want to jam that bar into place, but I want something really skinny to push down on that spring. So it's kind of a little bit of an awkward scenario there. And most often that little screwdriver I have works great. Sometimes apparently it doesn't. Oh. Go. Oh, it's just really, it's not wanting to cooperate today with me trying to do this in front of a camera. Usually it is easier than this. I apologize, guys, but you know, there's a reason I'm not really cutting this footage, taking this guy apart, so you can actually see what you're in for here. There we go. See how it kind of slid out? Once it's done, release this slowly. It's not super heavily sprung, but it does have a spring in there. Spring and a cap, which you can probably see there. So sit spring side down, the cap pushes on the underside of this little saddle, and that's what holds it in place from moving back and forth like I talked about. So keep in mind this, the grooved portion of this faces like this because what it's catching on, what actually keeps everything from going forward too far, is it snags against right here on the barrel. So just keep in mind that this groove faces this direction in the gun because it's going, this is what the barrel catches on, and when you pull this down, that's what allows the whole thing to slide forward. Okay, so at this point we have everything's kind of sitting in there. This is really two portions. You've got the trigger assembly and the rear sear assembly connected by the trigger bar. Both have to come out somewhat together in order for the whole assembly to come out. So let me see. I've actually done this before with a large screwdriver. Mine is kind of a little looser, so I don't always need it. If you notice, and it's kind of hard to see, you kind of have a nice ledge right there. It might be easier to see from this direction. So for removing the rear sear assembly, if you get a screwdriver and you put it against right there, and then you take the gun a little bit like this and push down on it, I don't know if you noticed, but that starts to pop the whole sear assembly out. You can also pry a little bit between the frame and the tabs. Be careful you don't mess anything up. But as you can see, mine's already slightly come out a little bit. So you can pry a little bit right here, or you can take a screwdriver or something and set it against that ledge right there, and then tap it from this side, which I'm going to have a hard time showing you. Front trigger assembly is much the same. I think I just got a screwdriver the first time. It was a little tighter, and just kind of gently pried like this. Make sure you don't gouge up your plastic. Once you get a little bit of traction, you can slide a small screwdriver under here and start prying it out. A little penetrating oil might not hurt on these assemblies. Just gently wiggle them, work them, be patient, don't damage anything. Like I said, the first time they were tighter. I don't have any problems now. Oh, and to some extent you can do the same thing with this guy. And let me see if I can show you. This ledge right up here, you can get a flat blade screwdriver and push against this bottom ledge a little bit, and it will pop up on the back edge. So you just kind of want to work these gently back and forth. Like I said, mine are a little looser because I've taken them out before. There's a little lube in there. You want to be careful not to pry too much on things like the slide release and the safety, because both are in there with, I wouldn't say delicate assemblies, but you want to watch how they come apart. So anyway, when you take out the rear sear assembly, you want to pinch this, and I'll show you why in just a second. In fact, I guess you can take out the rear sear assembly if you're really careful by itself. The trigger bar kind of has this guy on the end, so if you noticed, I had to kind of twist that, pull it around, bring it out. You do want to be careful. If you notice, this guy right here is held on. It's not too difficult to put back on. This guy, the safety has a small ball in there. You can just barely see it. So if I'm not changing anything with this, and I will show you guys how to take this apart in just a sec, but if I'm not changing anything, because I take this apart, play with the trigger a lot obviously, this is where my hard drive mounting comes in. I just set this thing on there and it's done. All the pieces hold together. Mostly hold together. Sometimes that little guy want to come up. So I don't mess with it. Now if you want to take it apart for some reason, you can. Obviously this little lever lifts right off and you just drop it wherever you like. There is the little tiny ball. Do not lose it. For the safety, you can see the ball detent. The safety, you kind of rock it back and forth. I'll show you a little better once it comes out. So you can see why I don't usually take that out. It's not terrible to get back in, but it's a little bit of a trick. So you definitely want to make sure you don't lose that little detent ball. My gun is pretty heavily oiled back here because I was working on it. And there, if you notice too, is a little spring for the detent ball. So be careful you don't lose a spring, although I've never had this one come shooting out or anything. So that is the rear sear assembly. Honestly, at this point, I don't see any reason to take this apart further. This sear assembly works great. I did not find any reason, although I guess I could clean up some of the old goop I have in there. I did not find any reason to take the sear assembly apart further. It is very limited in what it does, and it works great. If you want to, I know there are other videos on that. I believe what you do is drive out this pin that is sitting right there, and then you kind of pull apart that spring and take it apart. Like I said, I've never found any reason whatsoever to take this guy apart any further than this. The way this works is it simply pushes right there and drops the sear. This single action only sear has an incredibly short throw. As you can see, this is the whole wall. So when this pushes against it, that's it. That's the whole action. I found mine to be very smooth. It didn't need any polishing. Like I said, I don't see any reason to take this assembly apart. But if you wanted to, there's the pin. You slide that out, pull out this little coil spring. I'm sure it'll slide out with that, and then this whole sear assembly should lift up. If for some reason you want to take that out, can't imagine what it would be. Okay, so the front with the trigger, you slide this assembly out right here. Okay, so this is what I was talking about here with the spring as far as the slide release goes. I can show you the trigger first. Let me go ahead and remove this guy. So this trigger, the trigger is held to the trigger bar by a spring. Mine is not the factory spring because this is a prototype. My eventual one will use the factory spring, but that's neither here nor there. The trigger is held into the trigger box by another pin right there. Get out our trusty electrical tape. This is a little more difficult because this guy actually doesn't have as much room. So we line up with this pin. This was a little looser. I might be able to push this out by hand, honestly, or maybe not. Okay, so now the trigger pulls out of the whole trigger box. So unless you're replacing the trigger, I would not suggest taking your stock trigger off the trigger bar. Getting it back on with this little spring can be quite a trick. Those little pins for the little holes and everything. Like I said, I'm removing mine because this is I'm making a new prototype, and this was just a spring that I made for this. So works pretty well for the prototype, but the eventual one will go back to using the factory spring. So no reason to take apart further than that. If you are this far apart and you're in a polishing mood, you can polish this guy, the striker block activator. Make sure you don't remove any material of any significant amount. You can polish up the sides and everything, but don't grind on it. This guy right here is what I was talking about earlier, where I said it rides against this little follower assembly right here. You can kind of see where it's polished. So it rides just like this. So several of the bumps that you feel in your factory trigger are right here. So I actually used this, probably seems, and you can see also on the sides where it's impacting the plastic, where I've kind of cleaned these up and polished them a little bit so it's riding easier against the plastic. And you can see where I polished this edge because it also impacts. So I didn't take any significant material off, although I did round it off slightly, polish everything, and kind of polish those points down so this whole action is a little smoother. I honestly used one of my favorite tools for this sort of thing is a very smooth nail polishing board. I know, the fish are very sexy. So these things are great. They usually have a rougher side, which you can see I tore up on this, and a smoother side. I started with the rougher side, into the smoother side. You know, it doesn't take a lot. This is fairly hard steel, but you simply polish. You want, on this one, you can remove a small amount of material. You want to round this edge off a little bit and kind of take the peaks down on this guy and then polish it really good. So as you can see, I still haven't gone completely flat. This works great as it is. The peaks are a little bit down where those, I shouldn't say peaks, I should say steps, because it kind of steps up there. The steps are knocked down, so they're a little flatter. This edge has been rounded off a little bit. That helps quite a bit with both with the notchiness of the trigger in stock form. So, oh, I said I was going to show you this guy too. So this guy is the trigger or slide release, obviously. Wow, don't mind me. So this is a little bit odd. It's held in place by the same pin that holds the trigger into the firing block here. So you put this in at an angle and just slide it in, and then if you notice, you can see it line up right there. This is the spring that I was referring to. If this is kind of oversprung or anything, this pushing down too hard is what will cause you problems with your failure to hold back the slide on the last round. And also, you can see mine's kind of it's been polished a little bit on side, not seriously, but you can kind of see the lines in there. That was simply from me putting a little polishing compound in there and rubbing that guy back and forth. And you can also see on the inside of my gun there the mirror marks, I suppose, where it kind of clearanced everything, polished it smooth a little bit, so that it worked really nice and smooth, even with the lighter spring mech car. The little tab right here, if you do have a problem and you need to bend this down a little bit, be super careful that you don't break it off. That is what actually hits right there on this little shelf, and what pushes this up for the last round. So obviously that shelf slides up when you have rounds in there. It's not there. When the last round is done, it shoves against that and pushes it up. So if you're still having a problem, you can bend this down slightly. I wouldn't suggest it. I would say you're better off polishing the inside of this, polishing the inside of that, making sure that the spring does not have too much pressure downward. So you might also take this spring, like I said, and just kind of gently lift it up to bend it a little more closed. You still want it making contact with that, but it doesn't have to be super strong. This spring actually comes out. It's kind of got an extra little leg on it here. Oh, there we go. So this spring actually has a little leg. So if you're wondering later on where this goes, it slides right from the hole in there. Slides right there. So that's the whole assembly. I apologize for the camera not working very well. If you guys need to see anything more specific than what I've done, or you need me to show you putting it back together, just let me know. I might take a video anyway of putting it back together once I'm a little more satisfied with prototype trigger number 2. So we'll go from there. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate your time and hope I was, if not entertaining, at least informative. Have a great day, YouTubers.